guys, it's Shara from Woodshop Diaries, and today I'm going to show you how I built this mobile grill cart for my dad's Kamado Joe grills. Side note, is it Kamado Joe or Kamado Joe? This cart has open shelving, a storage cabinet, and can fit 1 or 2 ceramic grills. I've got the printable plans linked below if you're interested in building your own, but if you're ready to see how it came together, let's go.
This design was actually inspired by a similar cart that I've seen by Smoking Dad BBQ here on YouTube. However, to keep things simpler, I made a few modifications to the materials used, changed a few dimensions, and kept this design a little more open than his. I built this cart using basic treated lumber. 2x4s for the frame, 1x6s for the top, sides, and shelves, and 2x2s for the shelf supports. I would have preferred to use cedar, but it would have cost about 3 to 4 times as much, and since this was already a couple $100 in materials, I opted to stick with treated. These ceramic grills are really heavy, so I wanted to make sure to build a sturdy frame. I've detailed all the dimensions in the plans, but I cut down several pieces of 2x4 to assemble the front and back frames. I made this frame 32 inches tall and 72 inches long, and I laid these pieces out on the workbench to get a better visual of where everything went. Then I assembled the outside pieces on the top and bottom 2x4s first. I used black temper screws at the corners just for some decoration, but I used basic 2.5-inch decking screws for the rest of this assembly. I could certainly have used the temper screws throughout, but they're a little pricey, so I used them sparingly. After the corners were attached, I screwed the 2x4 for the middle shelf between the front 2x4 pieces to make what looks like a capital H. Then I moved these pieces to the floor and screwed together the rest of the pieces to make the entire frame. I made 2 identical frames just like this, one for the front and one for the back. Note that the middle shelf here is 16 inches below the top. You'd need to adjust this as needed to raise or lower your grill if building your own. I cut 12 pieces of 24-inch long 2x4s and drilled 1.5-inch pocket holes into the ends of each. Then I assembled the 2 frames together by screwing these pieces between them with Craig Blue Coat pocket hole screws. Now, these screws are made for use in exterior applications where regular zinc-coated pocket hole screws would rust and corrode. Obviously, since this is an outdoor project, you need to be sure to use exterior rated screws and hardware for the project. Now, I'll confess that I started this project without a good plan. I had a basic idea and decided to wing it as I went, and I actually ended up changing some things in the plans due to issues that I had in the build process. One of these changes is that the middle frame pieces seen here, those should have been attached flush to the inside of the middle section. Installing them in the middle of the 2x4 like shown here caused the openings for the grills to be smaller than I had originally intended. It still worked, but it was a pretty tight fit, so I made note of this and adjusted it in the plans that I linked below. After the main frame was assembled, I flipped it upside down and attached the caster wheels. I added heavy-duty caster wheels, and I'll link the exact ones that I used in the description, to the corners using some washers and 2.5-inch exterior screws. And at first, I thought that 4 was going to be enough, but I ended up going back and buying 4 more to add later. But I'll come back to that. For the middle cabinet and shelves, I used 1x6 treated wood. Now, let me clarify, I used 1x6s, not 5/4 decking boards. These boards were actually 3/4 inches thick, like a typical 1x6. You could use the thicker decking boards, but these were quite a bit cheaper and they worked just fine. I cut 3 of these to 32 inches to line the inside of the back middle section. There were some small gaps between the boards, which was intentional, so I just kind of clamped these in place and evenly spaced the gaps, then screwed these in using 1.25 inch decking screws. After the back was in, I did the same thing for the sides of the middle section, this time using 4 boards on each side. For the bottom, I cut 4 pieces of 1x6 to place across the 2x4 frame pieces on the inside. Now, I'll come back and notch out that front piece to look a little bit better later, but for now, I moved on to the shelves. I bought a couple of treated 2x2s to use as the shelf supports. I cut 8 of them to about 23 3/4 inches long, and I screwed them into the frame using 2.5 inch long screws on the outside pieces and 3 inch long screws on the inside. Since the screws on the inside pieces needed to go all the way through the side panel pieces and into the framing behind them, they are a little bit longer. I installed these so that they were 3/4 inches down from the top of the framing so that the shelves would sit down into them and be flush across the top later. So by this time the new caster wheels had come in, so I installed these on the corners of the middle section of the cart. After some thought, I decided that the top shelves needed an additional support to hold the weight of the grills. So I cut 2 more 2x4s to go in the middle of the top shelves. The bottom shelves won't be holding hundreds of pounds of grill weight, so I didn't add them there, just the tops. I installed these 3/4 inches down from the top and centered side to side with pocket holes and screws. Then I cut 16 shelf pieces to place across the supports in all 4 sections. Now, I'll come back a little later and notch out the corners of these so that they look a little bit better, so bear with me, we'll be back to this. At this point, I moved on to the top. I cut 5 pieces of 1x6 to go on the top so that they would overhang both sides, the front and the back, by 1 inch. I was going to have to rip a 1x6 to fit for the top, but I wasn't sure what size to rip it yet. This wood was pretty wet, so they were a little over 5.5 inches wide, and none of them were very consistent. So to make things a little bit easier, I installed the front and back pieces first, leaving 1 inch overhang on the front and sides. Then I spaced the rest of the pieces out between them to figure out how wide to cut my last piece. I spaced these approximately 1/4 inch apart and installed them with 2 inch decking screws into the framing of the cart. Now it was time to cut out the hole for the grills. These grills are round, but they have a box sticking out the back side. So this cutout needed to accommodate both the grill body and also needed a cutout for the box to fit. I took measurements of Dad's grill and I ended up cutting a 22 inch diameter circle with an 8.5 inch wide section off the back. This was another change that I made between this build and the plans that I've linked below. 22 inches was a little tight. I would have preferred it to be more like 23 to 24 inches for the hole, but because I screwed up with the middle framing, like I mentioned before, all I had was 22 inches. So in the plans, I've adjusted the dimensions to allow for 23 inch diameter hole to give it a little more space between the grill and the wood. I cut this out with a jigsaw and sanded the edges to smooth things out as best I could. Okay, so all I have left here is the door that's supposed to go right here. And I don't know what happened, but I miscalculated. And this is all the treated lumber that I have left. Just this one piece of 1x6 and then this like piece that I ripped to make, or what was left over from the thin strip that I had to rip for the tabletop here. It's a long drive to town, so I don't want to get another board. So we're gonna make do. Once again, here's something that I changed between the real build and the plans that I'm sharing below. Truth be told, I wanted to buy 8-foot 1x6 boards, and when I went to the store, they were out. So I had to buy 10-foot boards, and I hadn't figured what I needed for 10-foot boards, so I had to do some quick calculations in the store, and of course, I miscalculated, and I ended up being 1 board short. Because it's a 20-minute drive one way to town to get another board, I decided to just make do with what I had. I ended up cutting my 1x boards down to make a panel and used some strips that I cut off a 2x4 to kind of frame them out to make the door. This worked fine and I like the simple design, but in the plans I'll show you a simpler way of making the door just using 1x6s with some horizontal slats between them. Anyway, once the door was together, I installed it with some butt hinges and a simple latch so that it'll stay shut. Then I noticed that the shelf boards on the bottom shelves looked kind of odd being spaced so far back from the front edge. So to make the spacing look a little bit more even and not have such large gaps, I used a jigsaw to simply notch out the front corners of the shelf boards and the front piece in the cabinet section. And this is totally not necessary, but I just think that it looked a little bit nicer. At this point, I loaded it into the back of the truck and drove it over to my parents' house to get the grills in and set up in its new home.
And now a blanket disclaimer. Grills are hot and wood burns. Wooden grill carts are pretty common, but yes, they do come with a risk of catching fire. Just like grilling on a deck, grilling close to a house, or grilling anywhere near combustible materials. So here's your reminder to use common sense and check your own grill's clearance specifications. And also while you're grilling, just keep a check on if your grill is too hot or the surrounding material is getting too hot. And finally, always grill with a fire extinguisher handy, because even if the outside of your grill is cold as ice, if you open the lid and a piece of ash or a spark flies out, it can catch anything on fire.
We did also set these grills up on some concrete paper blocks so that they weren't sitting directly on the wood. Also, not sure if you noticed, but funny thing about these grills is that they're the same model, but they were purchased a few months apart, and as you can see, one of them is actually slightly taller than the other. Not a big deal, I just kind of found it odd. Anyway, now Dad is ready for all of his summertime grill outs. Let the summer begin. I really hope you guys enjoyed this build, and if you'd like to keep up with all the latest projects and videos, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. Thanks so much for watching, friends, and until next time, happy building!